Thanks for watching Slice of SciFi. I'm Noah Richmond,
I'm Lewis Howley.
and we are discussing Shang-Chi, our latest Marvel film, Legend of the Ten Rings. And so basically this is introducing yet another character that has, shows how well they're mining the Marvel universe at this point, that Shang-Chi is finally being brought to the large screen in his own feature, a character who was originally introduced as the master of Kung Fu back in the 1970s comic books. Somebody that is really the first mainstream Marvel production that is completely focused on an Asian character and predominantly Asian cast. And so this will be interesting to get our feedback and see what we thought of it. So Lewis, you want to start us out on any thoughts you had about the film?
Well, I will start out by saying that I did find it to be quite entertaining. I think that's always a bottom line for me with any movie is it worth going to see? Will it be engaging for audiences? And I think on that score, it does very well. Essentially, it's a family story set with various fight scenes staggered throughout that revolve to some degree around the issues of this particular family. And I will say that when I saw this movie, I thought about the difference between Disney short form movies, and by Disney I mean Marvel Cinematic Universe Disney, versus their long form projects that they're doing on their Disney Plus channel, which of course long form allows you to develop a storyline much more than you can do in a short, relatively short 2+ hours. And to some degree, I've always been concerned about the Disneyfication of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And by that I mean, in this movie, for example, the fights are essentially bloodless. You see people dying, maybe they fall off or something, or their soul gets sucked out, but it's not very gory. And I think back to the Avengers Endgame, where half of the population of the universe was wiped out. And of course, that was not allowed to stand ultimately, because I think it was too adverse for Disney. And so to that degree, I think that lessens the movie a little bit, because I think in that sense the fight scenes become a little more unreal.
Hmm. Okay, interesting. Well, for myself, I really found myself very engaged with the fight scenes, particularly in the earlier half of the film. I thought they really took a cue as somebody who was watching lots of Hong Kong action films back in the 1990s, when it was still somewhat more of an underground thing to be into. Um, I really thought they took a cue from a lot of the kind of films I was watching back then, and really incorporated it into the stunt work and camera work, and captured a lot of like the feel and the edge of your seat um, uh, thrills with the one-on-one kung fu battles that they were having. I did feel for myself that the film ran longer than it seemed like it needed to, and I did feel like some of the more fantastic sequences towards the end just somehow weren't as punchy. They didn't keep me as riveted and they kept going and going to where I wanted to be checking my watch by the end of it.
Well,
um,
oh, pardon me.
yeah, on the whole, I still feel like it was, um, that they did a pretty that they did a good job. That it was really did feel like they succeeded in coming out with good, solid, entertaining movie that was respectful to, culturally respectful, and successfully telling a story that merged East and West, and combined a lot of that kind of action style in its storytelling. So overall, I would say I'm pretty positive about it. My main hesitation. It's interesting what you're saying. I mean, let's certainly had this come out in a Hong Kong feature, they would not have shied away from the blood as much. But it's interesting that I didn't notice that, because I would have thought I'm somebody who would have noticed that, and I really didn't. Um, but my problem was more running time.
I will say that there was a beautiful scene in the beginning in the hidden area of Ta Lo, and there were many things in which the father and mother of Shang-Chi are first encountering each other, and their martial arts scene is very balletic, and it reminded me actually of Gene Kelly and Leslie Caron in An American in Paris in terms of the quality of that scene. And in the production notes, I noticed that they were saying that her style was based on Tai Chi, which I found interesting. Uh, and they mentioned several styles of martial arts fighting that Sean Chi's character participated in, most of which I'm unfamiliar with. And but there were also, I mean, the Ta Lo setting reminded me, of course, of Lost Horizon, the Hidden Kingdom. Although here it's an interdimensional kind of thing, so there's more of a science fiction tinge to it. And I will admit that when I saw Shang-Chi riding on the dragon toward the end, and this isn't giving anything away, it reminded me a lot of the never ending story. I mean, I couldn't help but think of it, when that was occurring. And
I'm
so,
sure you won't be the only one.
and so I thought, in that sense, I suppose one could argue that it's somewhat derivative, but I still think there was enough ingenuity, although there were um, I can't really discuss one of the things that bothered me about the ending because it would be a spoiler. But I will comment on the fact that Shang-Chi's character at one point confesses to Katie toward the end of the movie that he did something that he's very rueful about and that really plagues him. And and yet, when we have flashback scenes of almost everything else in his life, there is no flashback scene to that particular episode, which surprised me. And then it got me to thinking about how the MCU deals with the fact that its characters often are inevitably, you would think, suffering from PTSD at various points, from all the things they have to do. And so that brings me to the tone of this movie, because, there are very lighthearted moments in this movie, as there are in many of the MCU films. And, and balancing that with the more serious moments is a tricky business. I mean, you have to make sure that it's appropriate. And there were a couple times where I felt that there was a little bit of an incongruous shift in that respect, that the tone was, went from being kind of silly to super serious in, like the blink of an eye, and in particular with this scene where he's confessing about this deed he did that has troubled him so, it leads up to a more serious scene, but then you get to the end of the movie, which ends on obviously a comedic note, which is not totally inappropriate. But, after all that they went through, you would think that they would have to have some PTSD, or maybe this is their way of coping with it. I mean, I don't really know. And,
Hmm.
and I also was a little concerned about the sidekick, Katie, in the sense about her being trained to be um, skilled with weaponry in what seemed like an incredibly short amount of time. But, that's just a minor quibble.
Yeah, but it was one that really bothered me as well. I honestly, that was probably my other biggest complaint about the film is I just didn't understand why that Katie character was even there, and from the standpoint of just I just didn't find her very charismatic or very interesting. Um, and I don't know. I guess it's one of those either either you find that character appealing or you don't. But that I would have been much happier with, had he just been doing his own thing without her.
I did notice, though, that I thought of one reason why she might have been included. And that is in the beginning of the movie, like when she's with her family, we see subtitles when they're speaking in Chinese. And then when they go to Macau, again, there's quite a bit of subtitling going on. But there's a moment there in that scene where she says that she doesn't really understand Chinese. And suddenly the dialogue shifts to English. And so she, in some ways, is the foil that requires everyone to speak English so that we can avoid having subtitles, which, I thought, are we really at this point, that an audience will not tolerate subtitles in an MCU movie, and so I couldn't help but notice it though, because I thought it was so cool to have the subtitles in Chinese for the Chinese language. And then all of a sudden they're gone. Although they rarely do appear. They do appear a little bit later on, but not much.
Well, see, actually, it's interesting because one of the things that struck me was how much of the opening film, like the opening of the film, was entirely Chinese, subtitle, with English subtitles, and went on for you know several minutes. And I do have to, for me, I was thinking, wow, this is really daring of Disney, because families are going to be taking their kids to see this, and um, I could imagine this rankling some Western audience members. Yeah. Um, so I guess the other thing that I would say, I came to the film with not much background in it. I took it in, I enjoyed it. Having researched it afterwards, I can say that there does seem to be an ongoing issue when it comes to fans of the Marvel comics, particularly going all the way back to the 70s, and the way that these stories have been adapted in the current MCU. And there is particular sensitivity when it comes to like the Master of Kung Fu. In the 70s, his father was Fu Manchu, which, you know, at the time was a marketable villain character. Today, that is almost like a code word for anti-Asian slang. To say somebody's like a Fu Manchu. Um, but that is what it was in the 70s. And similarly, you also have the issue that Iron Man, his arch nemesis to a large extent, was a character called the Mandarin. And in the MCU, they really haven't been able to get to figure out what to do about that, because it doesn't really play so as well in a for a modern audience. It seems a little too overtly racial. um, but at the same time, when they had Iron Man 3 and they kind of threw the Mandarin in and they tried to be like, well, there's the Mandarin, but he turns out to just sort of be this actor and there isn't really a Mandarin, then that creates an outcry, because now you're taking something that's like a staple of somebody, of being a fan of this story. And so this film finds a way to try and address the Mandarin issue again in a way where you can bring it up where it's in the story, but try and place it where it's a little more culturally sensitive and something that would be more relevant to a modern audience. I thought that as somebody who just went into it not knowing anything different, I'm like, okay, it just seemed like whatever. But now that I've read up about to understand the background of all that, I'm not sure that they've really came up with a solution that's going to make people any happier who were unhappy before that the Mandarin wasn't really the Mandarin. And I don't know how to talk about it anymore without getting into spoilers. But I would say that I don't know that I'm not sure that this is going to put that particular controversy to bed.
It does raise an interesting point, though, because, they were in a position where they could have created an entirely new Asian superhero and just added it to the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And instead, they chose to go back to source material, even knowing the issues that would come with that, both from the fan perspective and from the racism that was manifested in the original comics, however it was perceived at the time. And so, again, that's an interesting choice to make, that somehow they wanted to go back to this. And I don't know, too, how much of that was affected by the fact that the 10 rings are mentioned in the first Iron Man film, and then we have the Mandarin in Iron Man 3. So did they feel committed, like they needed to tie that up? Or, so those are all good questions. And we haven't talked about the acting, but I will say that I felt, for the most part, the acting was quite good. To some degree, there are some characters that have to play stock roles. The aggrieved sister, the super kind wife, mother, and the troubled father. But still, I thought that they were infused with the quality that I would expect of the actors who portrayed them. And the sets, I thought, were quite well done, especially in Ta Lo. The effects were, of course, what you would expect from a Marvel movie. You don't expect them to be poor quality. There was one scene, though, where I could swear I saw a wire in a martial arts scene. But, that might have just been who knows, a slip of the eye, as opposed to it really being visible. But it wouldn't be the first time in movies that those kinds of things occurred, And, but yeah, I will say that I think that it's an interesting addition to this universe. I think that has the potential to be developed as a character. Although one thing I thought about is, if indeed these 10 rings make you immortal, as it seemed to be for Wenwu, the father, until he gave them up, um, then what does that bode for any person who's immortal who gets involved in a relationship with a mortal? At some point, the mortal is going to pass on. So there are those relationship issues that you have to deal with too. Although you can postpone them for a while, inevitably that has to happen. Which is why, when I thought for Wenwu's character, it seemed to me very naive to think that once he was married, that, it would be a shock that eventually his wife would be mortal.
Yeah, I guess that what's one of the other things where it's a little hard for me to speak to it, having not read any of the original comics. But my understanding of the character is that he was just like this completely amazing martial artist. But he wasn't some guy who had 10 rings and could, shoot energy blasts and like had some kind of, world shaking power. Like his power that let him fight on a superhero level was that he had some, kind of power over chi. And, like because he was so completely mastered in his martial arts. Um, but I guess that's another one where I think the whole idea of the 10 rings actually comes from the Mandarin. And I think that's, again, the Marvel Cinematic Universe trying to adapt its original source material into something that they can make play with the modern day. But I am speaking not out of a place of authority. That this is not something I read growing up, so I can't completely speak to it.
Understood.
No, I think that's about it in terms of thoughts regarding Shang-Chi. Overall, I did think it was a good time. I thought it was worth going to check out. I thought that they successfully created something that was, respectful and fun, and still managed to have laughs without actually laughing at it. So I would still give it a thumbs up with the caveat that I did feel it ran longer than it should have and overstayed its welcome by a bit.
I also would give it a thumbs up. I feel that it was a very entertaining film to watch and sit through. I definitely laughed out loud in places at some of the humor. The story, being fairly new to me, was interesting. I thought the developments were intriguing. I thought their use of flashbacks was well done. So I also would, say that this is a movie that's worth going to see.
All right. Well, that would be our thoughts on Shang-Chi and Legend of Ten
the
Rings.
Legend of the Ten Rings, yes.
And thank you for watching Slice of SciFi.
Goodbye.
Slice of SciFi.